What if the most dangerous moment in a murder investigation isn't the crime itself, but the moment someone talks too much? That question is where this story begins. Not with sirens, not with flashing lights, not even with blood, but with words. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Words spoken too early, words spoken too confidently, words that didn't match what the public was supposed to know. Because on a quiet Sunday in December, inside a gated estate meant to symbolize safety, success, and legacy, something happened that would fracture a family forever. 2 people were found dead. A son was taken into custody. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the story began to change. And the people telling it may have accidentally revealed far more than they ever intended. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever listened to someone explain a situation and felt that something was off? Not because of what they said, but because of how they said it? Too detailed, too calm, too rehearsed. That uneasy feeling? That's at the heart of this case. Because this isn't just a story about violence. It's a story about timing, about proximity, about family dynamics that crack under pressure, and about how a single sentence can echo louder than any piece of physical evidence. The public was told this was a tragedy. Investigators called it homicide. But somewhere in between, a different narrative began to surface. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's rewind. Brentwood, Los Angeles. A neighborhood where privacy is currency and silence is part of the deal. High hedges, long driveways, homes designed not just to impress, but to insulate. The kind of place where nothing is supposed to go wrong, and if it does, it's handled quietly. That's where the estate sits, valued in the 8-figure range. Multiple structures, main house, guest house, enough distance for independence, close enough for control. And on Sunday, December 14th, that carefully maintained bubble burst. 2 adults were found inside the main residence. Authorities would later describe the cause of death using clinical language. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. No embellishment. No emotion. Just facts. But facts don't exist in a vacuum. They exist inside families. Inside histories. Inside relationships shaped by resentment, dependence, and unspoken tension. Living on that same property was their adult son, Nick, 32 years old. Not in the main house, but not far either. Close enough to hear things. Close enough to see comings and goings. Close enough to know routines. And close enough to be noticed. Nick was arrested that same night. 2 counts of first-degree murder. That alone would be enough to fuel headlines for weeks. But the case didn't stop there. Because as investigators began piecing together what happened, another name kept surfacing. A name the public wasn't expecting to hear in this context. Tracy Reiner, reported as the adopted daughter of the family's famous patriarch. A figure whose connection to the household raised immediate questions. Was she a bystander, a confidant, or something else entirely? Reports would later claim that Tracy was arrested as well, accused of acting in concert with Nick. And that's when the narrative stopped being simple. Because families don't implode overnight. They fracture along fault lines that have existed for years, sometimes decades. In this family, it had plenty. But the most chilling moment didn't come from an arrest report or a charging document. It came from discovery. The bodies were reportedly found by the Reiner's daughter, Romy, 27 years old, young enough to still be seen as a child in some eyes. Old enough to understand exactly what she was looking at. Imagine that moment. You walk into a space that should feel familiar, safe, predictable, and instead, everything is wrong. Most people would freeze. Some would scream. Others would run. But according to reports, Romy did something else. She spoke, and what she allegedly told police would become one of the most unsettling details in the entire case. She reportedly warned investigators about a dangerous family member. Someone who, in her words, should be considered a suspect. Think about that. In the immediate aftermath of discovering your parents' bodies, your mind is supposed to be chaos. Shock, disbelief, grief colliding all at once. And yet, a name, or at least a direction, was already forming. Was it instinct? Was it fear? Or was it something she had been carrying long before that night? That single statement reframed everything. Because now this wasn't just about what happened on December 14th. It was about what may have been happening behind closed doors long before that date ever arrived. As police worked through the scene, the estate itself became a silent witness. The main house told one story, the guest house told another, and the space between them, the physical distance separating family members, began to feel symbolic. Close, but not together. Connected, but divided. And then came the interviews. This is where things get uncomfortable. Because when people are innocent, their stories tend to evolve around facts they learn over time. They hesitate. They correct themselves. They ask questions. But when people are hiding something, their words can move too fast. They fill in gaps that no one asked about. They use language that assumes knowledge they shouldn't have yet. And according to multiple accounts, that's exactly what started happening here. Nick spoke. Then Tracy spoke. And in separate moments, phrases appeared that didn't quite line up with what had been publicly released at the time. Nothing overt. Nothing dramatic. Just small verbal slips. Details that felt premature. Emotional reactions that didn't match the timeline. At first, they were easy to dismiss. Stress makes people ramble. Grief distorts memory. Shock does strange things to language. But here's the problem. The slips didn't happen once. They echoed. Similar phrasing. Similar framing. Similar assumptions. And when two people independently reveal the same premature detail, investigators don't call that coincidence. They call it a pattern. Ask yourself this. How do two people know the same thing before they're supposed to? Did they hear it from the same source? Did they discuss it beforehand? Or were they both working from the same internal script? Because there's a big difference between reacting to a tragedy and narrating it. And as the days passed, that distinction became harder to ignore. Public sympathy fractured. Online speculation exploded. Every new report seemed to contradict the last. The timeline blurred. Motives were debated. Loyalties were questioned. And looming over it all was the shadow of legacy. A famous family name doesn't just bring attention. It brings expectations, assumptions, protection, or at least it's supposed to. But what happens when that protection becomes pressure? When the image you're supposed to uphold clashes with the reality you're living inside. When silence feels safer than truth, until it isn't. This case forces us to confront an uncomfortable idea. Sometimes the most revealing evidence isn't physical. It isn't forensic. It isn't even intentional. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's linguistic. Sometimes it's the moment someone says we when they should say they. And that's where this story is heading. Because as investigators continued digging, they didn't just look at what happened inside that house. They looked at what happened after. Who spoke first? Who followed? Who corrected themselves? And who didn't? They listened to tone. They watched body language. They compared timelines. And slowly, a theory began to take shape. One that suggests the most disturbing details weren't revealed during the crime. They were revealed afterward, by the very people trying to explain it. So here's the question I want you to sit with as we move forward. What if the case didn't break because of evidence found at the scene, but because of something said out loud? What if the real turning point wasn't the arrest, but the moment someone accidentally told the truth too soon? Because next, we're going inside the Brentwood estate itself, room by room, structure by structure. And what investigators noticed almost immediately would raise a red flag that no amount of money or influence could make disappear. And once you see that detail, the rest of the story starts to unravel fast. What kind of house hides a crime so well that, from the outside, it looks untouched? That question haunted investigators almost immediately, because when they arrived at the Brentwood estate that Sunday night, nothing screamed chaos. No broken gates. No shattered windows. No signs of forced entry visible from the street. The lights were calm. The hedges were trimmed. The driveway was clean. It looked like every other quiet, expensive home where nothing bad is supposed to happen. And that's exactly what made it unsettling. This wasn't a cramped apartment where sounds travel through walls. This wasn't a chaotic household packed with people coming and going. This was a carefully designed property meant to separate, to compartmentalize, to give each resident their own controlled space. Which raises an uncomfortable question right away. If something violent happened here, how did no one notice sooner? The estate itself answers part of that question. The main house sits back from the street, shielded by landscaping that blocks sightlines and muffles sound. Long hallways, heavy doors, rooms designed for privacy, not visibility. It's a home built for discretion, not transparency. And then there's the guest house. Close enough to walk to in seconds. far enough to feel like a different world. That's where Nick lived. Not under the same roof, but not independent either. Close enough to observe routines. Close enough to hear late-night movements if the conditions were right. Close enough to be part of daily life, while still being physically removed from it. Ask yourself this. Is that distance a privilege? Or a pressure cooker? Because when you live on the same property as your parents but not with them, you exist in a strange limbo. You're not fully separate. You're not fully included. You're always nearby, always aware, always dependent in ways that aren't talked about openly. And investigators noticed that dynamic almost immediately. They didn't just walk through the main house. They mapped the entire property. Sightlines, distances, paths between structures. How long it would take to move from the guest house to the main residence. How visible that movement would be. Whether anyone would notice. The answer? Not necessarily. Especially at night. Especially in a home where privacy is assumed. The layout mattered because it challenged early assumptions. If there was no forced entry, that suggested someone with access. Someone familiar. Someone who didn't need to break in. But familiarity cuts both ways. Because when everyone has access, suspicion spreads fast. Inside the main house, the atmosphere shifted dramatically from the exterior calm. This wasn't a place where something exploded suddenly. This was a space where something unfolded without interruption. Investigators reportedly focused on the absence of disruption. Furniture wasn't overturned. Nothing suggested a prolonged struggle that moved through multiple rooms. Whatever happened occurred within a contained area. That detail matters. It suggests control. It suggests proximity. It suggests the victims may not have immediately recognized the danger. Which leads to another uncomfortable possibility. What if they knew the person they were with? What if they didn't perceive an immediate threat because the face in front of them was familiar? Think about that for a moment. How many times have people opened doors because they trusted who was standing there? The estate's design reinforced that vulnerability. Doors inside the home weren't built to lock down against insiders. They were built for comfort, for flow, for ease. Security systems protect against outsiders. They don't protect against family. And as investigators examined the timeline, the property's silence became louder than any alarm could have been. No neighbors reported hearing screams. No emergency calls were made from inside the house. No alerts triggered systems that would have drawn immediate attention. That silence raises a chilling question. Did the victims have time to react? Or did whatever happened catch them completely off guard? Now let's talk about the guest house again. Because while the main residence told one story, the guest house told another. It wasn't a temporary structure. It wasn't a casual crash pad. It was a fully functional living space. A place where someone could come and go without crossing paths with the rest of the household. That kind of setup offers freedom. It also offers opportunity. Investigators examined how often Nick was seen entering and exiting the main house. Whether his movements would have raised suspicion. Whether there were routines that made his presence feel normal. According to reports, there were. That's what makes this case so disturbing. Nothing about the setup felt unusual. Nothing about his proximity would have alarmed anyone. Being there didn't require an explanation. And when you don't need an explanation, you don't leave one behind. But the physical layout wasn't the only thing that troubled investigators. It was the emotional geography. This wasn't a household defined by warmth and constant interaction. By most accounts, it was compartmentalized. Separate lives coexisting on the same land. Communication filtered through tension, history, and unresolved conflict. And those dynamics don't show up in crime scene photos. They show up in behavior. As detectives worked through the property, they began asking a different kind of question. Not just how someone could have done this, but why no one stopped it. Because proximity creates awareness. And awareness creates responsibility. So who knew what was happening? Who noticed changes in mood or routine? Who sensed escalation but didn't intervene? And who benefited from staying silent? The estate became less of a backdrop and more of a character in the story. A place that facilitated isolation while creating the illusion of togetherness. It's the kind of environment where resentment can simmer unnoticed, where anger doesn't have to explode outward to be destructive. And that brings us back to Romy, because when she reportedly discovered the bodies, she wasn't walking into a chaotic scene. She was walking into stillness. And stillness can be more terrifying than noise. Investigators reportedly paid close attention to her movements. where she entered, what she saw first, how long it took before authorities were notified, whether anything appeared staged or disturbed after the discovery. Every step mattered, because discovery moments are revealing. They show instinct. They show priorities. They show what someone notices first. And according to reports, Romy didn't hesitate to contextualize what she was seeing. She didn't frame it as random. She didn't suggest an unknown intruder. She reportedly pointed inward, toward family. That instinct didn't come from nowhere. It came from living inside that environment, from sensing danger long before it materialized. Which brings us to a critical contradiction. If the estate was so quiet, so controlled, so insulated from the outside world, then whatever violence occurred was born inside those walls, not carried in. And if that's true, then the guest house isn't just a detail. It's a bridge between distance and access, between separation and involvement. And that bridge was crossed more easily than anyone wanted to admit. As the investigation progressed, detectives didn't just look at physical evidence. They looked at how the family moved within the space afterward. Who went where? Who avoided certain rooms? Who lingered? Who stayed away? Because people reveal attachment and guilt through avoidance as much as through presence. And this is where things start to get uncomfortable again. Because certain areas of the estate reportedly became off-limits in conversation. Not officially, not with tape, but emotionally. People didn't talk about them, didn't reference them, didn't acknowledge them. That kind of silence isn't accidental. It's protective, or it's fearful. Sometimes it's both. And when you place that silence next to the statements that would later be made publicly, a tension emerges. Because you can avoid rooms, but you can't always avoid words. And as we move forward, that tension becomes impossible to ignore. Because next, we're going to reconstruct the timeline of Sunday, December 14th. Hour by hour, decision by decision. And once you see how the timing unfolds, one question becomes unavoidable. If everyone was where they said they were, then how did this happen without anyone noticing? And if someone noticed but didn't speak up, what else aren't they saying? What if the most dangerous thing in this case isn't what we know? But what doesn't line up? Because once investigators started reconstructing Sunday, December 14th, something became immediately clear. This was not a clean timeline. It was fragmented, elastic, and strangely selective. Everyone involved seemed to agree on the date. Sunday, December 14th. That much was solid. But when detectives began asking the harder questions, when exactly something happened, who was where, and how long events took, the certainty started to crumble. And that's when the red flags multiplied. Let's start with what should be simple. The last known normal moments. According to reports, there were no public emergency calls from the home earlier that day. No alarms triggered. No neighbors reporting disturbances. On the surface, the estate moved through Sunday like any other quiet weekend day in Brentwood. Morning routines. Afternoon stillness. Evening calm. But calm doesn't mean uneventful. Investigators always ask the same foundational questions first. Who last saw the victims alive? When was the last confirmed interaction? Who can place themselves, with certainty, at specific times? And in this case, the answers came back vague. Some accounts referenced general time frames rather than exact hours. Phrases like earlier that day and later in the evening appeared more often than precise timestamps. That might not seem suspicious at first. But in a household where people live steps apart, time should be easier to pin down, not harder. Ask yourself this. If you live on the same property as someone, wouldn't you remember when you last saw them? Morning? Afternoon? Night? Or would you avoid specifics because specifics invite scrutiny? As detectives pressed for clarity, another issue surfaced. The estimated time of death. Authorities would later list the date as Sunday, December 14th. But the exact window became a subject of quiet speculation, not publicly debated at first, just internally flagged, because certain details didn't behave the way they should. If deaths occurred earlier in the day, why was there no immediate discovery? If they occurred later, why did certain reactions feel premature? This is where timelines get tricky. People often assume investigators work forward from discovery. In reality, they work backward from inconsistencies. And here, the inconsistencies were subtle, but persistent. Some statements suggested activity on the property during window. And here, the inconsistencies were subtle, but persistent. Some statements suggested activity on the property during windows when, according to other accounts, there should have been none. Other details implied knowledge of circumstances that weren't publicly confirmed until later. Nothing explosive on its own. But when you layer them together, they form a pattern that refuses to settle. Let's talk about proximity again. Nick was on the property. That much is undisputed. Living in the guest house meant he didn't need to explain his presence. He didn't need to clock in or out. He didn't need to announce himself. He was simply there. But being there creates an expectation of awareness. If something violent happened in the main house, when would he have noticed? If he didn't notice, why not? And if he did notice, what did he do with that awareness? Those questions became central as investigators examined reported movements. The problem? The movements didn't always match the narrative. Certain actions appeared delayed. Others appeared too immediate. Some responses suggested urgency, while others suggested detachment. And that contradiction is hard to reconcile unless you consider one uncomfortable possibility. What if the timeline people presented wasn't designed to explain what happened, but to contain it? Because when you're trying to control a narrative, you don't lie outright. You blur. You soften edges. You let details drift just enough that no one can pin them down. That's what Sunday started to look like. A day stretched and compressed depending on who was speaking. Then there's Romy. Her arrival at the house, and the moment of discovery, became the anchor point for the entire timeline. Everything before it was murky. Everything after it was documented. But even that anchor raised questions. When exactly did she arrive? Why then? Was it routine, or was it prompted? Reports suggest she discovered the bodies and contacted authorities. But discovery isn't just about time. It's about context. What was she expecting to find when she entered the home? Why did she go to those particular rooms? What drew her attention there? People don't wander aimlessly during moments of shock. They move with intention, even if they don't realize it. And then there's the statement, the one about a dangerous family member. Think about how early that came. Before any public suspect was named, before arrests were announced, before a full scene analysis was complete. That kind of instinctive accusation doesn't come from a single moment. It comes from accumulated fear. Which brings us back to the timeline again. What happened before Sunday that made that accusation feel obvious? What conversations occurred in the days or weeks leading up to December 14th? What tensions escalated quietly? Investigators don't just ask about the day of a crime. They ask about the week before, the month before, the arguments that never fully resolved. And according to reports, those conversations mattered here. Now let's examine the arrest timing. Nick was arrested that night. Same day, same evening. That's fast. Police don't make first-degree murder arrests lightly, especially in cases involving family members and high-profile names. They need probable cause, something concrete enough to justify immediate action. So what did they see? It likely wasn't just physical evidence. It was behavior. Who said what? Who reacted how? Who appeared more concerned with narrative than with shock? And this is where the timeline becomes emotionally revealing. Because people experiencing genuine surprise often ask questions. What happened? How could this happen? Why? But people who already know what happened tend to explain. They fill silence with certainty. They offer context no one requested. They assume details others haven't heard yet. According to accounts that would later circulate, certain statements made early on seemed to operate from a position of assumed knowledge. That doesn't mean guilt, but it does mean familiarity. And familiarity collapses plausible deniability. Another contradiction emerged around communication. Who contacted whom first? In crises, people reach out instinctively. They call siblings. They call friends. They call lawyers. The order matters. Investigators reportedly took note of call patterns. Who was notified immediately? Who wasn't? And which calls happened before authorities were even involved? Those patterns don't exist in isolation. They exist inside relationships. Who do you trust first? Who do you fear? Who do you need aligned with you before the truth spreads? Sunday's timeline wasn't just about minutes and hours. It was about priorities. And those priorities told a story. As night fell and the estate filled with law enforcement, the day's events hardened into official records. Statements were taken, movements logged, times approximated. But approximations can hide a lot, especially when multiple people approximate differently. And here's the part that makes investigators uneasy. When innocent people misremember, their errors diverge. When people coordinate, intentionally or subconsciously, their errors align. An alignment started to appear. Certain time frames repeated, certain phrases echoed, certain gaps matched. Not perfectly, but enough to be noticed. That's when detectives began treating Sunday not as a series of random events, but as a constructed sequence, one that may have been adjusted after the fact. And that's dangerous, because once a timeline is manipulated, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. Motive shifts, opportunity changes, intent becomes clearer. And this is where Tracy Reiner re-enters the picture. Because as attention focused on Nick's movements, questions arose about who else knew what and when. Was Tracy present on the property that day? Did she communicate with Nick before or after discovery? Did her statements align with his timeline or diverge? According to reports, alignment became the issue. Not presence, not fingerprints, but narrative harmony. And harmony, in investigations, is rarely organic. It's rehearsed, or it's shared, which brings us back to language again. Certain phrases appeared before they should have. Certain assumptions surfaced too early. Certain emotional beats felt misplaced. Investigators don't accuse based on vibes, but they investigate based on them. And Sunday, December 14th, gave them plenty to work with. As the timeline hardened into something closer to a theory than a fact pattern, one realization became unavoidable. If the official version of Sunday is incomplete, then the truth exists in the gaps. And those gaps aren't empty. They're filled with conversations that didn't make reports, with moments no one wants to revisit, with decisions made quietly under pressure. Next, we're going to talk about the moment those gaps became impossible to ignore. The moment Romy discovered the bodies, and the exact words she allegedly chose in that instant. Because that wasn't just discovery, it was direction. And once she spoke, the investigation turned inward permanently. What would you say if you walked into a house and instantly knew something was wrong? Not suspected, not feared, knew. Because according to reports, that's exactly what happened when Romy entered the home. This wasn't a moment of confusion. It wasn't a gradual realization. It was immediate. And what followed would quietly steer the entire investigation in a direction no one could undo. Think about the psychology of discovery for a moment. When most people stumble onto a traumatic scene, their brains scramble. Shock blurs details. Emotions override logic. Time distorts. Even memories become unreliable. But sometimes, shock doesn't paralyze. Sometimes, it clarifies. Investigators are trained to recognize that difference. Because when a person moves with purpose during discovery, it often means the mind has already been rehearsing something long before the moment arrives. According to reports, Romy was the one who found the bodies. The setting was not chaotic. There was no indication of a frantic search through the house. She went where she needed to go. That detail alone raised questions. Why those rooms first? Why that certainty? Why no hesitation? People don't wander randomly during emergencies. They go to places that confirm what they already fear. And fear, in families, rarely appears overnight. Let's slow this moment down. Imagine opening a door and being hit not just by what you see, but by what you already suspected. Imagine the weight of realization landing not as surprise, but as confirmation. Because according to what she allegedly told police, Romy didn't frame what she found as an unknown tragedy. She framed it as something caused. Specifically, she allegedly warned investigators about a dangerous family member, someone she believed should be considered a suspect. That sentence matters more than any physical detail, because it wasn't speculative. It wasn't cautious. It wasn't phrased as a possibility. It was directional. And in criminal investigations, direction is everything. Police don't operate on accusations alone, but they listen closely to who names danger first, especially when that danger is internal. Ask yourself this. How many families would immediately suspect one of their own in a moment like that? That kind of suspicion doesn't come from thin air. It comes from patterns, from behavior observed over time, from escalation that others may have dismissed or chosen not to see. Romy's alleged statement didn't just provide information. It provided context. And context reframes evidence. Once investigators heard that warning, every interaction, every movement, every prior conflict took on new significance. This wasn't about a random act of violence. This was about a family dynamic reaching a breaking point. And that's where the emotional weight of this case really begins. Because when a daughter points inward instead of outward, it suggests that danger wasn't unexpected. It suggests it had a name. Investigators reportedly treated Romy's account with care. Not skepticism, but seriousness. They asked follow-up questions, clarifications, timelines. They wanted to understand not just what she saw, but what she believed. Because belief often precedes evidence. Now here's where things get complicated. Discovery narratives are supposed to evolve. Initial shock gives way to clearer recollection. Details sharpen, gaps close. But in this case, the discovery narrative didn't evolve as much as it anchored everything else. Romy's account became the emotional foundation of the investigation. And once that foundation was laid, the rest of the case was built on top of it. Let's talk about what wasn't said. According to reports, Romy didn't emphasize confusion. She didn't ask investigators what they thought happened. She didn't express uncertainty about cause. She expressed concern about a person. That distinction is subtle, but crucial. It suggests that for her, the question wasn't what happened, but who did this? And police took note. Because when a witness jumps directly to who, it often means the what has already been mentally resolved. Now think about the timing again. This was before public arrests, before official statements, before the media narrative formed. Which means Romy's warning couldn't have been influenced by headlines or speculation. It came from inside the family, from lived experience. And that's where investigators shifted gears. They didn't just secure the scene. They began reconstructing relationships. Who argued with whom? Who felt threatened? Who had access? Who had motive? And suddenly, the guest house wasn't just a living arrangement. It was a focal point. Nick's proximity to the main house now looked different through this lens. Not suspicious by default, but relevant. Living nearby meant opportunity. Opportunity meant questions. Questions demanded answers. But here's where things get even more unsettling. According to later reports, Romy's warning wasn't vague. It wasn't framed as maybe or possibly. It was firm enough to influence investigative direction almost immediately. And that level of certainty carries emotional consequences. Because making that statement means accepting something devastating. It means acknowledging that someone you love, or once loved, may be capable of something irreversible. That kind of acknowledgement doesn't happen lightly. Which begs another uncomfortable question. What had Romy seen or heard before that day? Arguments? Threats? Escalation that others minimized? We don't have all those answers. And investigators rarely reveal them early. But the presence of that warning tells us something crucial. This discovery wasn't the beginning of fear. It was the culmination of it. As police processed the scene, they also processed Romy herself. Her demeanor, her consistency, her emotional responses. Contrary to popular belief, investigators don't expect people to behave normally in trauma. There is no normal, but they do look for alignment. Do emotions match circumstances? Do reactions match timing? Does the story hold under gentle pressure? According to reports, Romy's account didn't fracture under questioning. That matters. Because when stories fall apart, they usually do so early. And instead of creating confusion, her words sharpened focus. Which brings us to another detail that quietly influenced everything. Romy reportedly didn't attempt to shield anyone. In family crimes, there's often hesitation, a reluctance to implicate, a hope that silence will preserve what little remains. But that wasn't the tone here. Her alleged statement suggested urgency. As if she feared what might happen next if action wasn't taken quickly. Urgency is revealing. It suggests perceived danger isn't over. And investigators responded accordingly. Nick's arrest that same night didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in the context of a discovery narrative that pointed inward from the very first moment. But here's where contradictions start to surface again. Because while Romy's words directed suspicion, subsequent statements from others attempted to soften that direction. Some accounts emphasize confusion. Others emphasize grief. Still others emphasize shock. Those emotional tones didn't always align. And alignment, or lack thereof, became another silent indicator. People grieving the same loss often grieve differently. That's normal. But when grief seems to contradict urgency, investigators take note. Because urgency implies threat. Grief implies finality. Holding both at once is difficult. And as the investigation progressed, those emotional mismatches became harder to ignore. Another layer emerged. Romy's discovery forced the family into the public eye immediately. There was no buffer, no time to process privately. Everything unfolded under scrutiny. And under scrutiny, people reveal themselves. Some retreat, some perform, some over-explain. And this is where language enters the story again. Because after the discovery, statements began circulating that would later raise eyebrows. Not because they were false, but because they were specific in ways they didn't need to be. Details volunteered, motives inferred, emotional conclusions drawn prematurely. And once again, investigators noticed something familiar. Certain phrases mirrored one another. Certain assumptions overlapped, which raised a troubling possibility. What if the discovery narrative wasn't just individual perception, but shared understanding? What if conversations happened before police arrived? What if explanations were already forming before questions were asked? Because when multiple people align too quickly, it often means alignment didn't start in the interrogation room. It started earlier, in private. And that brings us to Tracy Reiner again. Because while Romy's discovery pointed investigators toward danger, Tracy's later involvement complicated the picture further. How did Tracy react to the discovery? When did she learn what happened? What did she say, and when? Those questions would become increasingly important as the case unfolded. Because in investigations, first reactions are often the most honest. Before narratives settle, before defenses activate, before words are chosen carefully. And Romy's first reaction was clear. She pointed inward. She named danger. And that single sentence, spoken in the most devastating moment imaginable, became the hinge on which everything else turned. Because once that door opened, it never closed again. Next, we're going to look closely at Nick Reiner himself. Not through headlines, not through charges, but through proximity, behavior, and pressure. Because being arrested is one thing, being expected is another. And the question investigators would soon confront was chilling. Was Nick shocked by what happened? Or was he bracing for it? And the answer to that question would change everything. What does it mean when the person closest to the crime scene is also the one most removed from the household? Because that contradiction sat at the center of everything investigators tried to understand about Nick Reiner. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a visitor. He wasn't an outsider who wandered in by chance. He lived there, not in the main house, but not away from it either. Close enough to be part of daily life. Separate enough to claim independence. A position that sounds comfortable on paper, but in reality, often breeds tension. Ask yourself this. If you're an adult child living on your parents' property, what does that do to your sense of control? You're not fully on your own. You're not fully under their roof. You exist in between. And in between is where pressure builds. The guest house wasn't just a place Nick slept. It was a psychological space, a buffer, a compromise. It allowed proximity without intimacy, presence without participation. And in family systems under strain, those arrangements don't happen randomly. They happen when relationships are already fractured. Investigators reportedly began by mapping Nick's daily routines. When he came and went, how often he interacted with the main house, whether his movements would have stood out on any given day. The answer was uncomfortable. His presence wouldn't have raised alarms. If Nick walked to the main house, no one would have questioned it. If he returned to the guest house, no one would have followed. If he moved late at night, it wouldn't have been unusual. That kind of invisibility is powerful and dangerous because it blurs the line between access and accountability. Now let's talk about timing again. Nick was arrested the same night the bodies were discovered. That's fast, especially in a case involving family, wealth, and public scrutiny. Law enforcement doesn't rush arrests unless they believe delay creates risk. So what created that urgency? It wasn't just proximity. It was behavior. According to reports, investigators focused closely on Nick's demeanor in the immediate aftermath. Not because grief has a right look, but because incongruence stands out. Some reactions were subdued. Some explanations were detailed. Some emotions seemed oddly controlled. Again, none of that proves anything. But in combination with other factors, it raises questions. When people are blindsided by tragedy, their stories tend to form slowly. They circle back. They correct themselves. They ask for information. But when people already know the shape of events, their narratives arrive fully formed. Investigators reportedly noticed that Nick's account did not drift much over time. Consistency can be. That push and pull can distort perception. Investigators reportedly looked into prior conflicts, disagreements, power struggles, financial dependence, expectations that weren't met. These aren't sensational details. They're common in families. But when layered with proximity and access, they take on new weight. Because motive doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from frustration, from feeling trapped, from feeling controlled, from feeling invisible. And the guest house becomes symbolic, a space given, but not chosen. Now here's where contradictions emerge again. Nick's arrest was announced quickly, but public details were sparse. Authorities didn't lay out a full narrative. They didn't parade evidence. They simply acted. That tells us something. It suggests the case wasn't built on a single smoking gun, but on a convergence of indicators. Access, timing, statements, context. And then there's the language issue again. According to later accounts, Nick made remarks that mirrored phrases used by others close to the case. Phrases that assumed details not yet released. Descriptions that seemed too aligned. Emotional framing that matched others almost exactly. Coincidences happen, but mirrored language under stress is rarely accidental. It usually comes from shared conversations, which raises a deeply unsettling possibility. What if explanations were discussed before discovery? What if narratives were rehearsed, not to deceive, but to cope? Because people often rehearse stories when they're afraid of being blamed, even if they believe they're innocent. But that rehearsal leaves traces, and investigators are trained to find them. Let's talk about silence. Nick reportedly did not make a public outcry proclaiming innocence. No dramatic appeals. No emotional interviews. Some people see that as restraint. Others see it as calculation. Neither interpretation is fair without context, but context is everything. Silence can be grief. Silence can also be strategy. Investigators reportedly weighed both possibilities. They examined whether Nick avoided certain topics, whether he redirected questions, whether he defaulted to rehearsed phrasing when pressed. And patterns emerged. Certain subjects produced short answers. Others produced lengthy explanations. Some areas were navigated carefully, almost defensively. That selective engagement is telling. People tend to over-explain what they fear scrutiny will reveal. They under-explain what they believe is already settled, which suggests Nick may have believed some conclusions were inevitable. But why? Another detail haunted detectives. Nick lived on the property. If something escalated in the main house, how likely was it that he heard something? Even muffled sounds, even raised voices, even movement. Complete unawareness would require a perfect storm of conditions. Possible, but unlikely. And investigators don't ignore unlikely scenarios. They test them. They walk the distance from guest house to main house. They measured sound travel. They recreated nighttime conditions. They asked a simple question. If someone wanted to move between these two spaces without drawing attention, could they? The answer wasn't comforting. Yes, easily, which reframed the timeline yet again. If Nick had access and opportunity, then the timeline gaps suddenly mattered much more. If he noticed something and didn't act, that's one kind of culpability. If he was involved, that's another entirely. And investigators had to explore both. But here's the detail that made everything heavier. Nick wasn't surprised by suspicion. According to reports, he didn't express disbelief that he was being considered. He didn't seem blindsided by the idea that investigators were looking at him closely. He seemed resigned. Resignation can mean many things. Acceptance of fate, emotional exhaustion, or recognition that something has finally come to light. Which interpretation fits here? That's the question detectives wrestled with. And it's not a question answered by evidence alone. It's answered by behavior under pressure. As the hours passed and the estate remained under investigation, Nick's role became increasingly central, not because of accusations, but because of absence. Absence of outrage, absence of confusion, absence of denial. Those absences speak, and they spoke loudly enough to justify immediate action. But even as Nick was taken into custody, investigators knew the story wasn't complete, because another name kept appearing in the margins. Another presence loomed. Tracy Reiner. Her relationship to Nick. Her proximity to the family. Her later statements. All of it suggested this wasn't a solitary narrative. It was shared. And shared narratives don't form spontaneously. They form through conversation, through alignment, through mutual understanding of what must be said and what must never be said. Next, We're going to examine Tracy Reiner's role in detail, how she entered the investigation, why her words mattered so much, and what investigators noticed almost immediately when comparing her account to Nick's. Because if Nick was close to the crime, Tracy may have been close to the story. What if the most important person in this case wasn't the one accused first, but the one who helped explain it? Because that's how Tracy Reiner entered the narrative. Not with sirens, not with handcuffs, but with words. Words that were meant to clarify, words that were meant to support, words that, over time, began to raise more questions than they answered. At first glance, Tracy's position looked straightforward. She wasn't the one living in the guest house. She wasn't the one arrested that same night. She wasn't the one whose proximity immediately troubled investigators. She was family, but adjacent. And adjacency can be powerful. Because people on the edges often see more than those at the center. They hear things secondhand. They absorb tension without being fully immersed in it. They become interpreters of chaos. That, at least, was the initial assumption. But assumptions don't survive scrutiny for long. Investigators began asking when Tracy first learned about what happened. Not broadly, not emotionally, specifically. Who told her? What exactly was said? And what details she knew at each stage? Those questions matter because knowledge has a timestamp. And when someone knows something before they should, the timeline starts to crack again. According to reports, Tracy became involved very quickly after discovery. Her reactions appeared composed, purposeful. She didn't seem disoriented by the shock in the way others were described. Some might call that strength. Investigators call it notable, because emotional regulation in moments of crisis can mean many things. Some people shut down. Some compartmentalize. Some step into roles they've already rehearsed in their minds. And Tracy appeared to step into a role, one of explanation. She didn't just react, she contextualized. She offered interpretations. She framed relationships. She filled in gaps. And filling in gaps is dangerous when facts are still emerging. Ask yourself this. Why explain when no one has asked yet? Why clarify before confusion exists? That instinct often comes from a desire to shape understanding before others do. Now, shaping doesn't automatically mean deception. Sometimes it means protection. Protection of a person. Protection of a legacy. Protection of oneself. But investigators don't guess which one it is. They test. They compare Tracy's statements to Nick's. They look for divergence. For independence. For organic difference in perspective. Instead, they reportedly found alignment. Not identical phrasing, but similar framing. Not shared facts, but shared assumptions. And assumptions are revealing. Because facts come from evidence. Assumptions come from belief. And belief comes from conversation. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable question so far. What conversations happened before authorities arrived? Were there calls? Texts? Urgent exchanges that never made it into reports? Investigators don't need to know every word. They need to know whether alignment existed before questioning began. And according to later scrutiny, alignment appeared early. Tracy's explanations didn't contradict Nick's. They reinforced them. That might sound supportive, loyal, familial. But in investigations, reinforcement is a double-edged sword. Because independent witnesses rarely reinforce each other perfectly, especially under stress. Their memories overlap. Their emotions differ. Their priorities conflict. When stories line up too smoothly, it suggests collaboration rather than coincidence. And collaboration doesn't have to be malicious to be problematic. It can be subconscious. It can be protective. It can be driven by fear. Fear of blame. Fear of exposure. Fear of what happens if the wrong version of events takes hold. Tracy's connection to the family added another layer of complexity. As an adopted daughter, her position within the family system was unique. She wasn't an outsider, but she wasn't part of the original parent-child dynamic either. That often creates a heightened awareness of balance, of loyalty, of maintaining stability. People in that position frequently become mediators, translators, buffers between conflict and collapse. Which may explain why Tracy's responses leaned toward explanation rather than emotion. But explanation has consequences. Because once you explain, you commit. And once you commit to a version of events, every new fact either supports it or threatens it. Investigators reportedly noticed that Tracy's statements left little room for uncertainty. She didn't express much doubt. She didn't speculate wildly. She didn't hedge. Instead, she spoke with a confidence that suggested internal clarity. That clarity had to come from somewhere. It could have come from direct knowledge. It could have come from conversations with Nick. Or it could have come from long-standing awareness of family tensions that made certain outcomes feel inevitable. Which of those is true? That's the question detectives began circling. Another detail stood out. Tracy didn't distance herself from Nick in her early framing. She didn't emphasize separation or lack of involvement. She spoke as if understanding was shared. That may sound like solidarity. Investigators heard something else. They heard proximity. Not physical, but narrative. And narrative proximity matters. Because when two people tell the same story, and that story later comes under pressure, both are implicated by its collapse. Now let's address the allegation that would later shock the public. Reports claim Tracy was arrested and accused of joining hands with Nick in committing the act. That's an extraordinary claim. It suggests coordination. It suggests intent. It suggests a relationship that went beyond emotional support. Investigators don't make such accusations lightly, which means something shifted between Tracy's initial involvement and later developments. What changed? The answer likely lies in contradictions. Not loud ones. Quiet ones. Details that didn't age well. Statements that conflicted with emerging evidence. Language that assumed outcomes investigators hadn't reached yet. As time passed, Tracy's explanations reportedly became points of comparison rather than clarity. Detectives placed her statements alongside Nick's and asked a simple question. Did these accounts evolve independently, or did they move together? And movement together is hard to ignore, especially when it appears under scrutiny. Another factor weighed heavily. Tracy wasn't just explaining events. She was explaining people. She characterized relationships. She contextualized behavior. She framed motivations. That's risky territory, because when someone explains another person's motives, they often reveal their own understanding of events. An understanding can imply participation, not always physically, but psychologically. And psychological participation is often where coordination begins. Investigators reportedly became interested in the emotional symmetry between Tracy and Nick. Their tone, their pacing, their choice of emphasis. These are not things people consciously align. They align when they've discussed something beforehand, or when they share a common understanding that predates the event itself. And that brings us back to Romy again, because Romy's warning pointed toward danger within the family. Tracy's explanations appeared to orbit around containment. Those two instincts, warning versus containment, don't coexist easily. One wants exposure, the other wants control, and control became the underlying theme. Control of narrative, control of perception, control of damage. As investigators followed that thread, they began to look at Tracy not as a peripheral figure, but as a node, a connector, someone who knew what Nick knew, or at least knew how to present it. Which raises the most unsettling question yet. What if Tracy didn't just help explain what happened? What if she helped decide how it would be explained? That question doesn't accuse, but it demands examination, because explanation is power. And power shapes outcomes. As scrutiny intensified, Tracy's role shifted from supportive to suspect, not because of a single action, but because of accumulation. Too much alignment, too much certainty, too much narrative cohesion. And cohesion, in cases like this, often masks fractures beneath the surface. Next, we're going to examine the moment everything accelerated. The interview slip. The sentence that lasted only seconds, but echoed through the entire investigation. Because once words escape, they can't be retrieved. And what was said next would force investigators to reconsider everything they thought they understood. But to see why that mattered, you need to hear exactly how the fuse was lit. What if the truth didn't emerge because someone confessed, but because someone spoke too soon? Because that's how investigators would later describe the moment everything shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't involve shouting or breakdowns. It was subtle, a sentence that didn't need to be said, a phrase that arrived before its time, a detail that assumed knowledge no one had publicly confirmed yet. And once it was out there, it couldn't be pulled back. Here's the thing about early interviews. They're dangerous, not because people lie, but because they talk before the story has settled, before attorneys step in, before everyone agrees on what should and shouldn't be said. Early interviews catch people in a raw state. Not just emotionally raw, but narratively raw, and raw narratives bleed. According to reports, one of the first interviews given after the discovery included a statement that immediately made investigators pause. Not because it was false, but because it was premature. The wording implied familiarity with the manner of death in a way that exceeded what had been released. It referenced specifics that, at that point, were known only to investigators and those present at the scene. That's when the air in the room changed. Detectives are trained to listen for more than facts. They listen for sequencing, for what comes before what, for assumptions embedded inside sentences. And this sentence carried assumptions. It assumed certainty. It assumed context. It assumed finality. The kind of assumptions that come from being inside the event, not outside it. Now let's be clear. This wasn't a dramatic admission. It wasn't someone saying, "I know because I was there." It was far more subtle. It was the casual way someone referenced injuries before official confirmation, the confident framing of cause before public disclosure, the emotional tone that matched conclusion rather than discovery. To most people, it would have sounded like grief. To investigators, it sounded like foreknowledge. And once that possibility enters the room, everything changes. Here's why. Innocent people tend to speak in questions early on. What happened? Do they know yet? Has anyone figured it out? But people who already know the outcome speak in statements. This is what happened. This is why. This is how it ended. And that difference is not accidental. It's neurological. When your brain has processed an event internally, it moves past uncertainty faster. It skips the questioning phase and jumps straight to explanation. That's exactly what concerned investigators. Because the explanation arrived too early. And here's where the situation escalated. After that first slip, similar language appeared again. Not identical, not verbatim, but conceptually aligned. A second interview. Another statement. Another moment where the framing assumed details still under wraps. And when two separate people share premature certainty, coincidence becomes less convincing. Because certainty is contagious. It spreads through conversation. And investigators began to ask a question they hadn't wanted to ask yet. Were these statements independent or coordinated? Now think about the pressure of those first hours. Phones buzzing, people asking questions, media circling. In that chaos, people talk to each other before they talk to police. They compare understanding. They align emotionally. They reassure one another. And sometimes they decide, implicitly or explicitly, how the story should sound. Not to deceive, to survive. But survival narratives often expose themselves through timing. Because when you agree on what happened before anyone asks, you risk saying it too early. And that's exactly what seemed to happen. Investigators didn't interrupt. They didn't accuse. They took notes. Because the most valuable admissions are the ones people don't realize they're making. As more interviews were reviewed, another pattern emerged. The emotional arc of the statements didn't match the timeline. People spoke as if the events were already processed, as if the shock had passed, as if acceptance had settled in. But acceptance doesn't happen in hours. It takes days, weeks, sometimes years, unless the outcome wasn't a surprise. That's the thought that chilled investigators. What if the emotional responses weren't reactions, but confirmations? And here's where the contradiction deepens. At the same time these premature details surfaced, other parts of the story were vague. Time frames blurred, movements softened, exact sequences avoided. So on one hand, there was too much certainty about outcomes. On the other, not enough clarity about actions. That imbalance is revealing. Because people tend to be vague about what implicates them and specific about what doesn't. Which suggests that certain details felt safe to discuss, and others did not. Let's talk about phrasing. Language isn't just what we say, it's how we say it. Investigators noticed passive constructions. Things like what happened to them instead of what was done. That subtle shift removes agency. It frames events as inevitable rather than enacted. And when that language repeats across multiple statements, it suggests shared framing. Shared framing suggests shared conversation. Which circles us back to coordination again. Now imagine being an investigator in that moment. You're listening to someone speak. You're not reacting. You're letting them continue. And inside your head, a checklist starts forming. How do they know that? Why say it now? Who told them? When? You don't interrupt the flow, because the flow is the evidence. And the flow kept revealing the same issue. Too much knowledge. Too early. Too confidently delivered. This is where